My name is Sloane Jerry, and this is my place in Canadian history. My family story began approximately 57 years ago on the small island of Sicily in the south of Italy. My grandfather left Italy to find better jobs because in Italy at the time, the jobs available were very low income, leaving him with very minimal money to support his family. It became very difficult for him to buy simple necessities such as food and clothes, pressuring him to leave with only what he could carry and leaving everything else behind. He had to leave his new wife behind until he could find a place for him and his family to settle. Many Italians wanted to leave, but because majority of them faced the same problem and couldn't afford plane tickets, they were forced to travel by boat. A large group of Italians docked in Australia because it was so close to Italy, and many others headed for the United States. But unlike the assumed trip to Australia or the United States, my grandfather progressed towards Belgium, where he would spend his days working manual labor, predominantly in the mines. He then left Belgium and went to Boston in the United States, where he would reunite with my grandmother and his daughter and meet his son for the first time and decide to stay with my grandmother's family for the time being. They decided to leave Boston because my grandfather didn't like my grandmother's side of the family very much and found that being there was very overwhelming and didn't want to stay with them any longer. My grandfather Giuseppe, my grandmother Giuseppina, and their two children Assunta and Giulio, who would later become my aunt and uncle, docked in Canada. They arrived in Canada just over a decade after World War II ended, so there wasn't as much of a violence threat anymore. They settled in Halifax, living for the time being with a relative of my grandfather. My grandfather then found another job working in the mines, as most immigrants did during the 1950s. In pockets of Canada, discrimination against immigrants was nothing short of normal. There was an issue with immigrant workers being paid significantly less than those who were Canadian born. This was difficult for my grandfather and his family because even though he had a job, he was being paid very little and still struggled to make ends meet. He wanted to give his family the best life he possibly could, so they moved again, but this time they went to Montreal. In Montreal, he found work doing manual labor again and eventually worked his way back to the mining industry. He was still being underpaid for all of his effort. Unfortunately, it was exhausting for Italian immigrants to stand up for their rights and freedoms because they could not speak English and they were a minority and others would not listen to what they had to say. This encouraged my grandfather to learn how to speak English and fight for what was right, for him and his fellow immigrants. They tried and tried to get someone to listen to them, but just as they had predicted, no one did. This frustrated many Italians. There was a large number of them that left and went back to Italy because even though the pay was no better, at least they could be with their families again and felt welcomed there. My grandparents decided to stay because they had already lost everything they had when they made the move from Italy to the United States, so they were in the mindset that nothing worse could happen at this point. But they were wrong because just at this time the October crisis began. This was a series of events that initially occurred when two government officials were kidnapped by the French-Canadian group Front de Libération du Québec. Montreal became more dangerous for the average family because the government decided to use the War Measures Act. This would allow police and other officials and persons of power to have the capabilities of basically doing whatever they wanted. 497 people were arrested without bail, and only 60 of them were released without charges. This frightened my family because they didn't want to be living in a place where it became difficult to step out of the house and go to work every morning, so they moved again, but near Elliott Lake. This was a prime spot for my grandparents because the mining industry was very high, which would mean that my grandfather would get paid more generously and allow my family to live a more luxurious lifestyle. Finally, they moved one last time in 1959. This time, they moved to Toronto. In Toronto, my grandfather acquired a more stable job working in a factory called the Canadian Folding Cartons, driving a forklift truck. He was later able to buy his own house and began opening his own home to other immigrants and gave them a place to stay. As the years went on, things were going very well for my family. In 1964, my grandparents had another daughter named Emma, who would also become my aunt, and 4 years later, in 1968, my mom, Lori, was born. When my mom was a young child, maybe 4 years old, my grandmother was diagnosed with ALS, also known as leukemia or Lou Gehrig's disease, and died less than a year later. A short time after, my grandfather remarried to a woman named Maria, who I would know as my grandmother, because he believed that his children should grow up with a mother. The years continued to pass, and eventually, in 1990, my mom met my dad, Jack, and in 1993, they got married. Then, 6 years later, on October the 2nd, 1999, I was born. I was the first of 3 children. My sister Logan was born in 2001, and my other sister Riley was born in 2007. My family continues to live in Richmond Hill and are very happy. I am working very hard on my sports as well as school and hope to one day become an agent working for the FBI in the Behavioral Analysis Unit. Although my grandparents have since passed away of Alzheimer's and cancer, I know that they are proud of me and my achievements and would be very pleased to see just how far Italians have come since the early 1950s. My family did not get the life they had handed to them. They had to work long and hard to find their place in Canada. My grandparents exercised all their rights and freedoms, such as voting when it came time for elections, and like many other immigrants, my family was so proud and honored to be Canadian citizens and were very patriotic. It meant everything for them to be living in a place where they didn't feel threatened, workers were treated fairly, and were respected. There were times when being immigrants was very difficult, but being proud, persevering, and caring for one another no matter what is what carried my family through those times. I am Canadian born and I am very lucky, but understanding what my family had to go through to get what I was born with has shaped me into the person I am today. I am so proud of my family and the struggles they had to go through to get us to where we are today, and I hope to someday get the chance to pass these stories, lessons, and values that have been passed on to me onto my children.